everyone, and welcome to our 15th weekly segment. We're going to start by looking at the progress of the war in Ukraine. This is January 20th of 2023. There's been a lot of talk recently about new Western aid to Ukraine, so let's start there. First of all, the UK has promised Ukraine 14 Challenger 2 main battle tanks. This is a big step forward that a lot of Western countries have been very reluctant to take. Now, 14 isn't a lot. The Ukrainian Chief of Staff has requested 300 tanks, but it is a start. The United States has also promised, among other things, 90 Stryker armored personnel carriers, which is something that Ukraine has been requesting, not the Stryker in particular, but both armored personnel carriers and infantry fighting vehicles. Now, earlier this month, America and Germany promised a combined 90 infantry fighting vehicles, the American Bradley and the German Marder. There's also been, as of yet, uncertain discussion about Poland and the Baltic states potentially sending Leopard 2 tanks made in Germany. Moving on from this, there was a helicopter crash this week, which killed 14 high-ranking members of the Ukrainian government, including the current interior minister. This was most likely an unfortunate accident. I say that because the use of this helicopter in the EU was temporarily banned in 2016, after a crash in 2016 which revealed serious safety problems with the design. So while this is definitely not great, it's almost certainly not a case of foul play. In diplomatic news, Russia is removing the Estonian ambassador from Moscow, and Latvia is removing their ambassador and kicking out Russia's ambassador from Latvia as a move of solidarity with Estonia, or at least that is what they're saying. Now, inside Russia, Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has made another comment on the lack of a formal end to the partial mobilization by saying that although the mobilization of conscripts as part of the mobilization has ended, quote, in addition to conscription of citizens for military service, partial mobilization also includes other measures necessary to ensure the fulfillment of the tasks of the armed forces. In this part, this decree continues to work. So this is another in a long line of excuses for refusing to end the partial mobilization, and that means that they are at least leaving the window open to another round of mobilization. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen, although it likely will sooner rather than later, but it is almost inevitable. And now I'd like to switch gears towards the focus of this episode, which is an interview given by Nikolai Patrushev, the current Secretary of the Security Council of the Russian Federation. Now, Patrushev is formerly head of the FSB until 2008 and is probably one of, if not the most influential people in the country after Putin. He's interesting in the sense that he is ideologically a lot more out there and a lot more extreme than Putin is, but he's also more pragmatic in the application of his beliefs than Putin has been over the course of this war. The interview starts with Patrushev suggesting that in most countries there is currently an economic, political, and spiritual crisis going on. Then he says that Western governments and politicians are controlled by corporations and business interests, and specifically singles out numerous members of the European Parliament as being, in his view, controlled by George Soros. Then Patrushev goes on to say, and I quote, "It is clear that the real power in the West is in the hands of resourceful clans and transnational corporations." Now, there are two things to say here. First of all, he most likely believes this. Patrushev is a statist like Putin. While he was head of the FSB, it was instrumental in taking back control of natural resources and media from oligarchs for the state, and usually for the benefit of those same security services. And back to George Soros, Patrushev describes the Soros Foundation as a driving force behind the color revolutions. Most likely saying this, he is thinking of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and the Rose Revolution in Georgia. And second, this view is very much in line with the more implicit view of most Russian state-sponsored media, in most cases. They are not trying to persuade people that Russia is a functional, non-corrupt working democracy. More, they are trying to persuade people that the West is actually not democratic and not as liberal as it claims to be, and really every country is just like Russia. They just hide it under a veneer of more pleasant rhetoric. Patrushev goes on to focus on the idea that the war is actually with NATO, and specifically with the United States and England, which are out to destroy and break up the Russian state, as they did to the Soviet Union. He also suggests that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, which is fairly standard rhetoric for the Russian state at this point, and that the United States has been committing functionally a cultural genocide in Ukraine. He goes on to compare the support for Ukraine to NATO involvement in Afghanistan, which it should be noted at the time was supported by Russia, and Putin described it as being in Russia's national security interest to have NATO doing the work to keep their southern border stable and secure. He also says that the only reason America left Afghanistan when it did was to prepare for war with Russia in Ukraine. Now, perhaps the strangest part of this interview is the part where Patrushev compares climate science and the idea of taking action based on climate science to the Holocaust. Now, that sounds incredibly hyperbolic, so I want to read out the whole quote. Overseas science proposes to evaluate people by the amount of carbon they leave behind. Humanity is measured and counted in the same way that Nazi scientists once measured skulls in search of criteria for dividing higher and lower races. Does he believe this? No, probably not. The way the Russian state treats the idea of fascism is, I want to say, very unhealthy and very symbolic. When the Russian state references Nazis or fascism, it isn't so much these people have the same beliefs as the fascists that we fought back in the war. It's more about a declaration of enemies. And if you want to read into it a little bit more, you could make a case that it's about describing people who want, in their view, to destroy Russia. Because to a lot of these people at the top of the Kremlin, particularly Patrushev and Putin, to lose the war in Ukraine would to some degree mean the end of Russian civilization, not necessarily immediately, but in the short to medium-term future. An open and democratic Ukraine would first of all represent a threat to Putin's government in a moment of crisis, and something that the Russian people could look to as an alternative if they no longer want what Putin is offering. And specifically in Putin's case, he very much identifies himself with the nation as a whole. So if Putin is removed, to some degree Russia will also be irreparably damaged and potentially destroyed. Most likely they see it as Russia would become a sort of puppet state to the West, which is how they see Ukraine now. And more than that, as a purely national security matter, think about how the US and a US president might feel if Russia was occupying, say, California. California is inseparably part of the United States. It is a key economic center. And more importantly, Russia is an enemy. You don't want your enemy on your doorstep occupying your territory. Now, to be clear, this is not an accurate comparison, but this is how it looks to Patrushev and to Putin, and so this is a good lens through which to understand their beliefs and their actions. So, Nazis tried to destroy Russia and the Russian state. The West is trying to destroy Russia and the Russian state. Hence, the West are Nazis. Not so much an objective analysis of reality, more it is both a propaganda technique, a propaganda phrase, and a almost Schmittian friend-enemy distinction. And there is one final thing that I want to comment on, which isn't so much news to anyone, I think, but it is a good insight into the minds at the top of the Russian state for people who haven't been following it closely or for very long. Another direct quote, "Russian business must be nationally oriented. Private capital, as well as the authorities, should think about the long-term development of the country." So Russian business, nationally oriented. So business in Russia exists to carry out the will of the state and, more broadly, even metaphorically, the nation. This has been our 15th weekly segment, and thank you for listening.